Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about how a single rule change that apparently is not a big deal can actually have a strong effect on a game. Now, the example I'm going to use is World of Warships, and I'm relying heavily on the mighty Jingles, who is a YouTube video maker. He's sort of the dean of the people who make YouTube videos about World of Warships and World of Tanks, and there are a lot of them, and he has over 500,000 subscribers. And he understands how games work. So he described this, and I'm taking him at his word. Now, what had happened in World of Warships is they had redone aircraft carriers and made them much less vulnerable, and at the same time given them rocket planes that had a hard time missing and did a fair bit of damage. This was especially tough on destroyers. The destroyers couldn't conceal themselves from the rocket planes, and they rely heavily on concealment and torpedoes to cope with the battleships and cruisers and even other destroyers. There's a lot of cover in World of Warships, in other words, islands to hide behind and so on. So even though it's daytime, the destroyers can be quite effective. But they were a lot less effective when the aircraft carriers could attack with their rocket planes. And this is World War II technology, by the way, but the rocket planes seem to be quite common even in carriers that wouldn't have had that technology. And they invariably would hit, because when the aircraft carrier controller hit the button to shoot the rockets, there was no delay before the rockets arrived at the target. In other words, there was no chance for the destroyer to dodge. Well, the result was that there were a lot fewer destroyers in the game. And that meant there were a lot more battleships in the game, because battleships are afraid of destroyers because of the torpedoes. Well, when there are fewer destroyers, you can have more battleships. This also meant there were fewer cruisers, because the battleships tended to be cruiser killers, where the cruisers were destroyer killers. But when there were fewer destroyers, you didn't have the need for cruisers, and at the same time, the cruisers were more vulnerable to all these extra battleships. Well, the change that was made by wargaming was to provide a delay between the time that the carrier player hit the button and the time that the rockets arrived. And this meant that the destroyers had a chance to dodge. Makes sense, doesn't it? But it made a big difference. Why? Well, once the destroyers felt that they had some control over their own survival, that they could dodge, more destroyers came into the game. With more destroyers in the game, there were fewer battleships in the game. With fewer battleships in the game, you also got more cruisers. And with more cruisers, then destroyers were a little more vulnerable, because the cruisers were destroyer killers. The result was that the game went back to how it had been before the rocket planes had been introduced, or at least that's what seemed to happen as far as Jingles could figure out. So think about all those dominoes from just one little change in the rules. Unfortunately, wargaming doesn't seem to have very many game designers on their staff. They may be more interested in making money than designing a good game, because the game seems to get worse and worse over time. And if they add submarines like they're planning to, like they have tested, then that's going to probably make it go even farther into hell. But that's neither here nor there. The point here is one simple rule change going through a lot of plays made quite a big difference. Thanks for listening.